Their ships were massive, their technology advanced, and their warriors feared by all. They ruled entire star systems, conquering worlds without hesitation. No one dared challenge them. Yet, today, that was about to change. Aboard the human vessel Eclipse, Captain Alicia Hart stared at the flashing red lights on the command deck. The ship's sensors had detected something strange, a large group of ships entering their star system. The readings were unusual, far beyond the capabilities of most alien species they had encountered. These were no ordinary ships. "Captain," came the voice of her sensor officer, Lieutenant Zhang. "We've got a fleet coming in fast. They're using a hyperdrive signature I've never seen before. It's not from any of the known empires." Hart's heart skipped a beat. The last time an unknown fleet arrived, it was the Xanthians, and that battle had nearly destroyed Earth. This was different, though. These ships were enormous, and they had arrived with a speed and force that suggested no intention of diplomacy. "Can we identify them?" Captain Hart asked, her voice calm but sharp. "No, Captain," Zhang replied, his voice tinged with fear. "But they're definitely not friendly. They've already bypassed the outer defenses." A loud alarm suddenly blared, cutting through the tense silence. The fleet had entered Earth's defense range. Captain Hart's fingers hovered over her console as her mind raced. She quickly gave the order to activate shields and ready all weapons. There wasn't time to wait for answers. She needed to prepare her crew for what was coming. "Red alert! All hands to battle stations," she shouted, her voice carrying through the ship. "We don't know who these ships are, but we'll be ready." Her crew moved swiftly, efficiently. There was no panic, just the steady determination of people who had faced danger before and survived. The Eclipse was not a warship, but it was equipped with the latest technology. Its stealth systems could make it hard to detect, and its weapons were potent, though they were no match for an entire fleet. The first officer, Commander Reynolds, stepped forward. He, too, was scanning the monitors, trying to make sense of the situation. "Captain, they're closing in fast. They'd got a battle formation." The alien fleet was advancing in a perfect, synchronized pattern. Their ships were enormous, much larger than any human vessel. The sleek, dark designs of their ships gave off an intimidating presence, their powerful engines glowing as they moved with terrifying precision. "They're not waiting to negotiate," Hart muttered under her breath. She didn't have to look at Reynolds to know what he was thinking. This was a fight for survival. The ships had no insignia, no markings to indicate who they were, but there was no time for speculation. Hart's focus shifted entirely to the incoming threat. If they were hostile, humanity needed to respond quickly. A harsh crackle filled the comm system as an alien voice, deep and mechanical, echoed throughout the ship. The transmission was in a language unfamiliar to any human, but it was clear from the tone that they weren't offering peace. "Human vessel, surrender now. Your resistance is futile." The message repeated itself, this time in English. It was the same message they'd heard countless times from other invaders, but this time there was an added weight. The Halar Empire, whoever they were, was not asking. They were demanding. Captain Hart took a deep breath. She couldn't show fear. Not now. Not ever. "Prepare for battle," she ordered. "Target their lead ship. We're not going down without a fight." Lieutenant Zhang's voice came through again, this time with urgency. "Captain, their lead ship is enormous. It's charging up its weapons. I've never seen anything like this. We're in range. They'll fire any second." Hart's eyes narrowed. They hadn't come for negotiations. The Halar Empire was here to destroy. The Eclipse wasn't prepared for a fleet of this size, but there was no turning back now. She glanced at Commander Reynolds, who gave a grim nod, his eyes reflecting the same determination she felt. "All hands, brace for impact," she said. "Engage at will. Let's show them what humans are made of." Energy striking the shields. The ship rocked violently, but the shields held, barely. Hart's heart raced, but she kept her focus. They had to hold their ground. She gave orders to fire back, targeting the Heller ship's weak points. The Eclipse's weapons fired with precision, hitting the alien ships with lasers and missiles. But it was clear the enemy had the upper hand. The Heller fleet was overwhelming, and their firepower far exceeded anything the humans had ever faced. "Captain," Reynolds shouted, "they're too strong. We can't fight them off." "I'm not giving up," Hart responded firmly. "Keep fighting." For a moment, the Heller fleet seemed to hesitate. The lead ship paused its attack, and for a fleeting second, the humans wondered if there might be some opportunity to escape, to fight another day. But just as quickly, the enemy fired again, this time with more intensity. The Eclipse's shields flickered, and then, with a gut-wrenching sound, they collapsed. The ship was wide open. The Heller Empire had made their move, and it was clear they hadn't expected the Eclipse to fight back. But Captain Hart wasn't going down without a fight. She knew the battle was far from over. Humanity had faced impossible odds before. They would face them again. And this time, they weren't going to lose. The Heller fleet arrives. The Eclipse shook violently as another round of energy blasts from the Heller fleet struck its weakening shields. The hum of the ship's emergency systems echoed through the corridors, and the crew scrambled to keep things under control. Captain Alicia Hart gripped the edge of her command chair, trying to stay calm as the chaos unfolded around her. "Shields are down to 30%, Lieutenant John reported, his voice tinged with panic. "Patch into the secondary shield generators," Hart ordered, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to buy some time." As the crew scrambled to reroute power, the view screen showed the massive Heller ships, closing in with terrifying speed. Their enormous size made them look like giants in the vastness of space, their dark hulls sleek and menacing. Their engines burned bright, and their weapons, designed for destruction, loomed threateningly. The fleet moved in unison, their ships arranged in a tight formation. They had clearly prepared for this fight, and every move they made was precise, calculated. The humans on board the Eclipse had no idea who these aliens were, but it was obvious they were not here for peace. "Their lead ship is enormous," Commander Reynolds said, his voice low and tense. "It's bigger than anything we've ever faced. They're clearly the command vessel." "Is it armed?" Hart asked, her eyes narrowing as she studied the enemy formation. "Fully armed," Reynolds confirmed. "I'm detecting weapons systems powering up across the fleet. They're about to attack again." Hart's mind raced. The Eclipse wasn't a warship, and their weapons were no match for a fleet of this size. She needed to buy time to figure out a strategy, to make the Heller Empire think twice about this attack. Before she could give any orders, the Heller fleet fired. The first blast hit the Eclipse's hull with a deafening boom. The ship lurched, sending everyone tumbling across the deck. Sparks flew from the control panels, and alarms blared. Captain Hart slammed her hand on the console, holding on for dear life as the ship rocked from the impact. "Status report," she shouted, her voice hoarse but commanding. "Structural integrity at 60%. Lieutenant John responded. "Hull breach on decks 3 and 4. We've lost power to auxiliary systems." "Shut down the damaged sections," Hart ordered. "Seal off those decks and reroute power to the engines. We need to move." As the crew scrambled to carry out her orders, Hart's eyes remained fixed on the view screen. The Heller fleet wasn't just a force of destruction. They were organized. Their ships moved with perfect coordination, each one complementing the other. There was no sign of hesitation, no sign of weakness. They were confident they would win this fight. "Captain," Commander Reynolds said, his voice tight with frustration, "we're not going to win this with conventional tactics. We need something they're not expecting." Hart didn't hesitate. "Get me the ship's tech officer. Now." Seconds later, a young technician appeared on the comm screen. "Captain Hart, what can I do for you?" Sharp. "Anything that could give us an edge." The tech officer looked hesitant, but quickly pulled up a list. "We got a few options, but nothing we've tested in battle. We've been working on a prototype energy shield disruptor, but it's only in its testing phase. How long to get it operational?" Hart pressed. "Maybe 10 minutes if we bypass some of the safety protocols," the technician said. "But it's risky. It could overload the entire system." Hart took a deep breath, weighing the decision. "Do it. We don't have a choice. We need to hold them off long enough to make our move." As the technician scrambled to activate the device, Hart turned her attention back to the battle. The Halar fleet was advancing again, their ships unleashing a new barrage of energy blasts. The Eclipse shuddered under the assault, but its shields, though weakened, held just enough to keep the ship from breaking apart. "Captain, they're locking onto our engines," Lieutenant Zhang warned. "They'll disable us if we don't move now." "Evasive maneuvers. Bring us around to 47 degrees," Hart shouted. The ship's engines roared to life as the Eclipse veered to the left, narrowly avoiding another blast from the alien fleet. The Halar ships weren't just powerful, they were relentless. Every time the Eclipse made a move to avoid the attacks, the enemy adjusted their course, staying in perfect formation. It was as if they knew exactly how to counter every move the humans made. "Shields at 10%, Zhang shouted. "Get that disruptor online," Hart barked. "We don't have much time." As if in response to her command, a burst of energy shot out from the Eclipse's lower turret. The experimental weapon fired in a crackling burst of blue light, hitting one of the Halar ships dead center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the enemy ship's weapon systems flickered and shut down, as if the blast had somehow scrambled its targeting systems. "It worked," Zhang exclaimed, a hint of disbelief in his voice. But before the humans could celebrate, the rest of the Halar fleet shifted its tactics. The flagship fired another round of energy blasts, this time aimed directly at the Eclipse's engines. "Brace for impact," Hart ordered, bracing herself against the console. The ship was hit again, but this time, the blow was catastrophic. The Eclipse shook violently as its engines began to sputter, threatening to shut down completely. The crew felt the tension building in their chest as the alarms blared, signaling that time was running out. "Captain," Reynolds shouted, "we can't survive another hit like that. We need to make a run for it, or fight back harder." Hart's mind raced. They had to make a choice. There was no more time to hesitate. "Prepare to jump to hyperspace," she ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Get us out of here, now." The Eclipse's engines roared to life once more, the stars outside blurring as they prepared to escape the Halar fleet's clutches. But as the ship powered up for the jump, the Halar fleet closed in faster than they could escape. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to outwit an enemy that had underestimated humanity. Her eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding on the screens before her. The Eclipse had barely survived the initial bombardment from the Halar fleet. The alien ships loomed large and menacing, their weapon systems primed for another devastating strike. But the humans aboard the Eclipse had a different idea. This fight wasn't over yet. "Status report," Captain Hart barked, gripping the sides of her chair. Every second counted, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Shields at 5%. Lieutenant Zhang responded, his voice trained. "We're losing power to secondary generators. Hull integrity is holding, but we're not going to survive another direct hit." Hart took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment that would decide their fate. She had to act now. There was no time for second guesses. "Commander Reynolds, what's our current position?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension coursing through her veins. "We're nearly in range of their flagship, Captain," Reynolds replied. "We could make a run for it, but we'll be easy targets if we do. They've got us pinned." Hart's mind raced. The Eclipse wasn't fast enough to outrun the Halar ships, and their firepower was overwhelming. But there was something the humans had that the Halar Empire didn't: ingenuity. They might be outgunned, but the Eclipse's crew wasn't about to back down. "Bring us closer to the flagship," Hart ordered. "We need to disable their weapons systems." "Captain, are you sure?" Reynolds asked, disbelief in his voice. "That ship is a fortress. We'll be flying straight into the fire." "I'm sure," Hart said, her voice unwavering. "This is our best chance. We can't wait for them to make the next move." The Eclipse angled toward the Hailer flagship, trying to evade the continuous barrage of enemy fire. Every blast that missed sent a jolt through the ship, but the humans held their ground, knowing their only hope was to act before the Hailer could overwhelm them. "Shields are failing," Zhang shouted. "They're locking onto our engines again. We'll be sitting ducks in another minute." Hart's pulse quickened as the countdown to disaster ticked away. The Hailer flagship was drawing closer, its weapons charging up for another strike. The Eclipse was barely holding together, but the humans aboard the ship weren't ready to surrender. "Launch the disruptor," Hart commanded. "Now." The experimental energy disruptor fired, sending a blue pulse of energy toward the Hailer flagship. For a moment, everything went silent as the pulse struck the flagship's outer shields. The enemy ship's energy systems flickered, and the firing sequence stalled. It was a small victory, one that would give the Eclipse a brief window to strike back. "They've lost power to their weapons," Zhang exclaimed, his voice filled with astonishment. "We've got an opening." Hart's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. This was it, the one chance to turn the tide of battle in their favor. The Hailer fleet, so confident in its power, had just been caught off guard. But the moment was fleeting. The flagship would repair its weapons soon enough. "We've got one shot at this," Hart said, her voice cold with determination. "Target their main reactor. Fire everything we've got." The Eclipse's weapons systems powered up, and the ship launched a barrage of missiles and energy blasts toward the Hailer flagship's vulnerable reactor. The missiles struck true, and the flagship erupted in a violent explosion. The shockwaves sent ripples through space, sending debris flying in every direction. For a moment, it seemed as though the Hailer flagship might be finished. But then, from the smoke and debris, the flagship reappeared, damaged but still operational. The enemy ship wasn't going down that easily. The Hailer were relentless, and their ability to adapt was terrifying. "We've damaged their reactor, but they're still functional," Reynolds reported. "They're powering up for another attack." Hart's grip tightened on the console. "We've only slowed them down, not defeated them. Brace for another hit." The Eclipse shuddered again as the Hailer flagship unleashed a new wave of fire. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure, and alarms screamed as more systems failed. But the humans were still fighting. They weren't done yet. "Captain, their reinforcements are coming in," Zhang shouted. "We can't keep this up for much longer." Holding on, and the Hailer fleet was closing in with no sign of slowing down. The damage to the flagship had been a victory, but it wasn't enough to turn the tide. The Hailer Empire would not be defeated so easily. "Commander, prepare for evasive maneuvers," Hart ordered. "We need to pull back and regroup. We're not finished yet. Humanity doesn't back down." The Eclipse angled sharply, avoiding another direct hit as the crew worked feverishly to keep the ship intact. It was clear now. This wasn't just a battle of weapons. It was a battle of wits. And the Hailer Empire had made a mistake by underestimating the humans. Captain Hart would make sure they paid for it. The human advantage. The Eclipse was barely holding together. Its shields flickered weakly as the damaged systems struggled to keep the ship functional. Captain Alicia Hart, though exhausted, refused to back down. She stood at the command center, watching as the Hailer fleet regrouped after their initial strike. The damage to their flagship had only slowed them for a moment. Now, the alien armada was closing in again, more focused, more determined. "Shields at 5%, Captain," Lieutenant Zhang reported, his face pale with stress. "We can't take another hit like that. Our engines are running at half capacity, and we're losing power everywhere. Captain Hart nodded grimly. She knew they were running out of time. Every second that passed was another step closer to certain destruction. But there was one thing the Hailer didn't understand yet: human resilience. "We've fought through worse," Hart said, her voice steady despite the pressure. "We'll fight through this too." The Hailer fleet had made a critical mistake when they attacked. They thought they could easily overwhelm the Eclipse, but they underestimated the humans on board. Captain Hart and her crew weren't just soldiers. They were survivors. They had faced impossible odds before. And now, the fate of humanity rested in their hands. "We need a plan," Commander Reynolds said, his voice tight with urgency. "Evasive maneuvers. Keep them guessing." As the Eclipse jerked into motion, the Hailer fleet reacted. They halted, clearly unsure of what the humans were doing. The Hailer flagship, though clearly damaged, remained in the lead, trying to assess the threat before them. Its sensors would pick up the surge of false energy from the Eclipse, and it would appear to the alien forces as if the ship was preparing to launch a devastating strike. For a brief moment, it worked. The Hailer ships slowed their advance, exchanging uncertain transmissions. Hart could see the confusion on their faces through the comms channels, and a slight flicker of hesitation showed on their readouts. This was the opening they needed. "Captain, their fleet's hesitating," John reported. "They're not sure what to do. The flagship's signaling to retreat." Hart allowed herself a brief moment of hope. She had anticipated this, but seeing it happen in real time was still a relief. The Eclipse had, for a few moments, turned the tables. The Hailer were reconsidering their strategy, unsure of the human vessel's true capabilities. However, this was only the beginning. The Hailer Empire wasn't just going to give up. They were a proud, dangerous race, and pride often led to recklessness. "Don't let them regroup," Hart barked. "We need to keep pushing the illusion. Make it seem like we've got more reinforcements on the way." Reynolds worked quickly. "Activating the signal for the decoy ships," he said. The Eclipse would project false signals indicating additional ships on the way. The Hailer would believe the humans had reinforcements ready to jump into the battle. It was a risky move, but it could work. The Hailer's dilemma. As the Hailer flagship began to pull back, Captain Hart couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. She had played them. The alien fleet was confused, their strategy thrown into disarray. They were reconsidering their attack, and that hesitation was all the humans needed. "Captain, they're signaling a retreat," Zhang said. "It looks like the Hailer are pulling back." For a moment, the crew of the Eclipse stood in stunned silence. Had they done it? Had they managed to force the Hailer to back off? But Hart wasn't celebrating yet. She knew the Hailer weren't going to abandon their mission without a fight. This could be a trap, a feint. They had to stay alert. "Stay vigilant," Hart said, her voice sharp. "The moment they regroup, we're not just dealing with one fleet. We'll have to face everything they have." The crew held their breath, waiting. The seconds stretched into eternity. And then, as if on cue, the Hailer fleet began to shift. The flagship wasn't retreating. It was preparing for a final, all-out assault. The humans had bought themselves some time, but the true battle was just beginning. The Hailer's last stand. Captain Alicia Hart's eyes were glued to the view screen. The Hailer fleet had stopped retreating and was now regrouping for what seemed like a final, all-out assault. The Eclipse, though battered, had managed to buy itself some time with the illusion of reinforcements and powerful weapons, but now the stakes had risen even higher. The Hailer Empire was not one to retreat quietly, and their pride would not allow them to back down easily. "Captain, their flagship is powering up," Lieutenant Zhang called out, his voice tense. "It looks like they're getting ready to launch a massive strike. They're using their entire fleet as one cohesive force. If we don't act fast, we won't survive this." Hart's heart raced as she processed the information. The Hailer were no longer uncertain. They were about to strike with everything they had, and the eclipse was in the heart of the storm. Is the disruptor still functional? Hart asked, keeping her voice calm, even though her mind was working furiously. It's functional, but at a reduced capacity, John replied, his hands flying over the console. We can still fire it, but it might not have the same effect on their flagship. That's better than nothing, Hart muttered. She had one last gambit left, a final attempt to slow the hailer down before they were overwhelmed. Prepare the disruptor. Get ready to fire as soon as we're within range. She turned to Commander Reynolds, her expression grim. We're going to have to rely on everything we've got left. Do you think we can hold them off long enough for reinforcements to arrive? Reynolds hesitated before answering. We can't afford to wait for reinforcements. If they hit us with everything, we'll be done for. We have to make this last stand count. Hart nodded. The odds were against them, but the humans aboard the Eclipse had already proven that they could survive the impossible. Now, it was time to see if they could win the impossible. The battle intensifies. A storm of energy blasts lit up the dark expanse of space. The Eclipse twisted and turned, its engines sputtering as the crew tried to keep it out of the enemy's line of fire. Every hit they took brought them closer to their breaking point, but they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. We can't keep dodging like this, Zhang shouted, his voice tight with fear. The shields are almost gone. One more direct hit, and we'll be a sitting target. Hart gritted her teeth, her mind racing. She had to find a way to stop this. Launch the decoys, she ordered, her eyes scanning the screen. We need to confuse their targeting systems, make them think we're everywhere. The Eclipse released a barrage of small, explosive decoys, sending them in different directions. The Hailer fleet reacted immediately, their ships splitting apart to avoid being struck by the false signals. For a moment, it seemed as though the humans might have bought themselves some breathing room. But the Hailer were quick learners, and within moments, they regrouped, focusing all their fire on the Eclipse once again. Target their flagship, Captain Hart commanded. We're not running anymore. We're standing our ground. The crew of the Eclipse worked in perfect unison, bringing their remaining weapons online. The ship shook violently as they fired everything they had left at the Hailer flagship. The energy pulses from the Eclipse flew through space, hitting the flagship's shields with a tremendous force. But it wasn't enough. The Hailer flagship retaliated, unleashing a barrage of its own energy weapons. The Eclipse's shields cracked and shattered under the assault. The ship groaned as the hull was pierced in multiple places. Systems began failing, alarms blared, and the entire crew was thrown into a state of chaos. Captain, Zhang shouted, we're losing life support in several sections. Hull breaches reported on decks 3, 4, and 7. Hart's heart raced, but her focus never wavered. The Eclipse was still standing, and that was all that mattered. As long as they could keep the Hailer distracted, they had a chance. We're not finished yet, Hart roared. Keep firing. We can't. The once booming sound of explosions and laser fire had faded, leaving only the hum of the Eclipse's failing systems and the distant cries of wounded crew members. The Eclipse had survived, but at what cost? Captain Alicia Hart stood on the bridge, looking out over the damage. The Hailer flagship had been destroyed, and the alien fleet had retreated, but the human victory felt hollow. The Eclipse was crippled, with several sections of the ship barely holding together. There were countless wounded, and some of the crew had paid the ultimate price, yet they had forced the Hailer to retreat, and that was a win no one could take from them. Status report, Hart ordered, her voice steady but full of unspoken grief. Shields down to 12%, Lieutenant Zhang responded, scanning the console. Life support is offline in sections 4 and 5. We're still holding in the main areas, but it's a miracle we're not completely gone. Commander Reynolds stepped forward. The Hailer didn't expect us to survive, Captain. We've hurt them. Badly. They're not going to take this lightly. They'll regroup, and when they come back, it'll be worse. Hart nodded, her mind racing. We don't have the luxury of resting. We need to move. Now. The crew had fought with everything they had. Their victory had been forged with sweat, blood, and sacrifice. But even as the Halar fleet retreated, Captain Hart knew that this battle was just a small piece of a much larger war. The Halar Empire would not forget the humiliation they had suffered, and they would come back, stronger, smarter, and more dangerous. We need to find a safe place to repair, Reynolds said, his voice grim. The Eclipse won't survive long without extensive repairs. If the Halar return before we're ready. We'll be ready, Hart interrupted, her tone sharp. We're not done yet. The Halar might think they've seen everything we have, but they've underestimated us. If they want a war, they'll get one. But this time, they'll regret it even more. The Halar regroup. Deep within the Halar flagship's command center, the remaining commanders were in an uproar. The battle had not gone according to plan. Their greatest fleet had been humbled by a single human ship and its desperate crew. The arrogance that had led them to underestimate humanity was now replaced with something far more dangerous. Rage. Prepare the reinforcements, the Supreme General of the Halar Empire growled. We'll strike at the humans again, but this time, we won't hold back. The Halar were known for their relentless aggression, and now, with their pride wounded, they were more determined than ever. The humans had revealed themselves. Eclipse was drifting in the dark reaches of space, hiding among the debris fields of a shattered moon, far from any major trade routes. The ship had been patched up as best as the crew could manage, but it was clear that they needed a proper refit, a safe haven to rest, regroup, and prepare for what was coming next. Captain Alicia Hart stood on the bridge, watching as the stars flickered by. The victory against the Halar had come at a high cost, but they had done the impossible. They had survived, and they had forced the Halar Empire to reconsider their attack. But Hart knew it wasn't over. The Halar would return. They always did. Captain, we've made contact with the fleet. Lieutenant Zheng's voice broke the silence. The reinforcements are on their way. The colonies have heard about the victory, and they're sending ships to rendezvous with us. Hart nodded, but there was no joy in her expression. The calm was a brief respite, a moment to catch their breath. But the storm was coming. The Halar weren't the kind of enemies who accepted defeat, and their retaliation would be swift and brutal. The only question now was when. Set a course for the rendezvous point, Hart said, her voice firm. We need to get to the fleet, and we need to be ready for what comes next. I don't trust that the Halar will give us time to repair. They'll be looking for us, and they'll have learned from their mistakes. As the ship slowly turned towards the rendezvous point, Hart couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Halar had made a grave error in underestimating humanity, but they were not stupid. They would be more cautious, more careful, and they would learn. And when they did, they would strike harder than ever before. The Halar's dark plan. Back within the heart of Halar space, the Supreme General and his commanders were devising their next move. The defeat they had suffered at the hands of the Eclipse had shaken their confidence, but they were a race built on conquest, and they knew how to adapt. This will not go unpunished, the Supreme General said, slamming his fist on the table. The humans have embarrassed us, but their arrogance will be their downfall. We will hunt them down, destroy their colonies, and wipe them from the galaxy. Let them think they have won. This time, we will strike without mercy. A high-ranking Halar officer stepped forward. We have identified their route, Supreme General. They're heading towards a rendezvous point with reinforcements. Our fleet is already on its way. By the time they arrive, we will be waiting. The general nodded. Good. We will catch them off guard again. They will think they are safe, but we will strike fast, strike hard, and we will not stop until the Eclipse is nothing but debris floating in space. The Halar had learned their lesson. No more underestimating the humans. This time, they would make sure the humans never had the chance to regroup. The gathering storm. Back on the Eclipse, the crew had grown restless. The quiet of space was unbearable, and every day that passed without news of the Hailer's movements felt like a ticking time bomb. Captain Hart knew that despite their victories, they had little time before the Hailer returned. "Captain," Reynolds said, his voice low, "we've got a problem. Our scanners are picking up strange signals. It looks like a Hailer fleet is on the move, and they're heading in our direction. They've found us." Hart's eyes hardened. "I knew it wouldn't be long." The crew rushed to their stations, preparing for battle. The Eclipse wasn't ready for another fight, but there was no choice. They had to survive. They had to keep fighting, no matter how badly damaged the ship was. The reinforcements hadn't arrived yet, and it was just them, just the Eclipse and its brave crew, against the wrath of the Hailer Empire. "We'll fight," Hart said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "We'll fight until the last breath. For every life lost, for every inch of our people's pride they've tried to crush, we'll make them regret ever thinking they could defeat us. This time, we will show them that humans never surrender." The crew was ready for battle, but the odds were still stacked against them. With their shields nearly gone and most of their weapons offline, they had no choice but to fight with everything they had left. The final showdown. The Eclipse shuddered as the first blast from the Hailer fleet struck the weakened shields. The damage was immediate, and alarms blared throughout the ship. They had no time to waste. This would be the final showdown, the fight for humanity's survival. Captain Hart held onto the armrest of her chair, her face set in determination. The Hailer had made one mistake already. They had underestimated humanity. And now, they were about to learn the true meaning of regret. "Fire everything we've got," Hart ordered. The crew unleashed all their remaining firepower at the Hailer fleet, sending waves of energy blasts towards their enemies. The Eclipse fought with every last ounce of strength, its damaged systems running on borrowed time. As the Hailer fleet began to retaliate, it became clear that this battle would be unlike any other. The fight was brutal, chaotic, and brutal. A desperate struggle where every shot counted, where every moment could be the last. But as long as the Eclipse was still standing, as long as the humans aboard it were still fighting, there was hope. And as long as there was hope, the Hailer would never win.